We've all probably seen that famous picture of Yeshua depicted as a shepherd leading a flock with a little lamb curled up into his arm. Maybe we've read the book of Psalms and imagined what it must have been for David playing his harp under the shade of a tree while the flock grazes in the field in front of him. Things look really nice. What is the real relationship, however, between a shepherd, a pastor, and his flock? Is it always so idyllic? Is it always so passive and serene? Or does a pastor ever have to deal with wolves or bears or goats or just contrary sheep? Does sheep have to put up with a pastor or a shepherd that doesn't know what he's doing? Mike, you're all wise. You're all you're well experienced. I think you know the answer. So I'm going to turn this over to you and just sit back and see what I know.
Well, you've asked, you brought up a bunch of topics there that are we could be on for multiple hours here. In the midst of that, you know, of course, brought this word of pastor and relating it to shepherds. That's where we want to go today. And there's verses of scripture that, you know, of course, are our favorites. Then there's that list that is intriguing to me. And the verses of Jeremiah chapter 23. I remember many years ago, as I was just being introduced to this concept of what has been termed the greater Exodus. And so in going back and studying it, I didn't really, you know, though I was looking at the greater Exodus scriptures, the verses that intrigued me were the verses prior to that. And those verses begin in verse 1. And it says, the shepherds are destroying and scattering the sheep in my pasture. And then he goes on to say that he will raise up shepherds according to his own heart. Mm-hmm. You know, when people ask me, Barry, about the end times, about where I see us at, what am I looking for? That's the section of scripture that I'm looking for. Because without shepherds, without pastors, the greater Exodus is going nowhere.
Agreed.
It's not going to make it to the edge of the Red Sea or the Reed Sea if we don't have shepherds. And I believe that part of the problem that we read about, which is called the book of Numbers, and let's face it, most of the book of Numbers is about, and part of Exodus, but mostly the book of Numbers is about the wheels falling off the bus. Because the relationship between Moses, the shepherd, the people, the sheep, was never really figured out. Unless we get that figured out this time, all we'll do is repeat what happened the last time. And it wasn't really good. I mean, 2 out of hundreds of thousands of people getting into the land, that's not really what we want, I don't think.
No, and the chief shepherd didn't make it in either.
Yeah. And I mentioned this to you yesterday as we were discussing briefly what the direction to go here. And I actually said this to Hanok a few minutes ago when I recorded with him. And I think it really resonated with him. That Moshe spent 40 years on the backside of the desert learning how to be a shepherd. But the people spent 0 time in Egypt learning how to be a sheep.
Yeah, the transition for those that were a part of the Mitzrayim Egyptian society of that day, they recognized that their role was one of servitude.
Yeah.
Now, they had a much higher pedigree in lineage and calling and destiny. Problem was they didn't have any clue about any of those things. They may have had faint remembrances of their stories about who their grandfathers were, but they certainly were not living up to that quality of life.
Mm-hmm.
So I think they failed in large respect to understand exactly how far they had fallen. And so they had come to a place of just, this is what's required of us, comply, comply, comply. And of course, that has some bearing on our current world societies. So when someone shows up and says, we're not destined to live this way, there's a greater promise, and your painful cries have been heard, and I've come in as an answer to that. They didn't know what to do with that. They didn't know what to do with Moshe. They didn't know how to follow someone other than Pharaoh and his assigned overlords. You would think that when the sea divided and they went across on dry ground, and then Pharaoh was destroyed behind them, that once and for all, everything would have been settled.
You would think.
There's a line of leadership training that I heard many, many years ago, that the gist of it is you're only as good a leader as your most recent victory. You may have done spectacular things, led in really great ways in the past, but what have you done for us lately?
That's not just a concept of leadership. That's a concept of life. I remember years ago when I had a job of selling cars. I could not stand that industry. It really didn't matter. You could have sold 15 cars the day before, but what have you done today? It's all about performance base, and so it's not about relationship base. Let's look at it this way, Barry. That when Moshe comes into Egypt, these people don't really, it's been 40 years. Many of the people that may have known of him have died. These people don't know who he is. He comes in with signs and wonders and all kinds of things. Well, they had been serving a Pharaoh that it's obvious had some lying signs and wonders. They've been serving a Pharaoh who had abused them, had put them into slavery, cared less about them as a people. And so when Moshe comes in with a different attitude, a different heart, a different mindset regarding the people, they kept looking at him through the eyes of the Pharaoh that had abused them. They could never make the line in the sand. I believe that for most of the people that were in Egypt, that came out of Egypt as adults, that all through the time in the wilderness, they still viewed Pharaoh, or they still viewed Moshe the same as they had viewed the Pharaoh.
Mm-hmm.
They never accepted him as a shepherd. Now, what does that have to do with today? It is another layer on top. That you and I both have talked many, many hours regarding this, privately and online, regarding those who have been called shepherds or pastors over congregations, have only abused the flock. We read news reports of all kinds of abuse, physical abuse, that has happened because of pastors, so-called pastors. And then someone comes out of that system, meets someone who is truly a pastor, but yet is never able to embrace them as such, because they're continually viewing them through the eyes of that other person before.
Yeah. Mike, I had the fortunate experience of knowing some very good men who were pastors. I can recall some church pastors that I am familiar with that genuinely loved their people. They were tender, they were compassionate, they knew how to draw a firm line and hold that line when it was necessary. I listened to their stories about their war stories, is what we kind of call it,
Mm-hmm.
and how the Father gave them the wisdom that they needed to proceed through whatever the circumstance was. These same men may or may not have been the most, well, let's just be realistic about it, the most entertaining and captivating in the pulpit as far as their oratory skills. Some of them were very good. Others, they were, more a thought and a prayer, and this is what's in my heart for you today.
Yeah.
But even if you're not the greatest at delivering a sermon, when the people know that you genuinely love them and care for them and are only really concerned about their spiritual maturity and growth, they will follow you. The idea that one is very charismatic and very persuasive in their delivery of a sermon, they may have great skill and enthusing and captivating an audience and getting a lot of verbal and physical hurrahs and response. But it doesn't mean that they really know how to deal with people. The very basics of pastoral leadership. Many years ago, it was taught to me in training. They want you to marry the couple, dedicate their children, preside over their family funerals,
Yep.
and preach to them on Sunday. When they're sick, they want to be able to call you and expect that you'll show up. I've had to tell multiple congregations, look, if you're sick or if you need me to come see you because of some circumstances developed, don't anticipate that I'm aware of it. If somebody doesn't let me know, how do I know that you're in the hospital or sick at home? I don't know unless someone tells me. So don't assume, make the phone call or have someone else to make the phone call and let me know. Once I know, I'll come.
But see, that's the concept, Barry, that you're talking about of the relationship between shepherds and sheep has to be a two-way.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, it can't just be one way. I walked into a church in Spring Creek, Florida that had over 49 years. It had 27 preachers. Two of them had not made it. They'd been voted in and had not even made it to the first Sunday. Two of them had committed suicide after being there. A couple of others had died. There was all kinds of crazy stuff. There was a number of them that were running around with the women in the community. And I walked into that.
Wow.
Not knowing anything. I had no idea how to be a shepherd to begin with. I just had a love for the people. And I remember showing up at the hospital the first time that I had someone that had not even been attending for a long while. Their husband was terminally ill, and I remember showing up at the hospital, and the family looking at me like, "What are you doing here? Why are you here? We don't understand what you're doing." And I stayed the whole night, and was actually there, with the family, and they were like, "We've never had anybody do something like this." To me, it was just obvious. But they were not going to reach out to me because they had never had anyone they could trust. So this thing about walking out the relationship of shepherds and sheep is something that in our day, it hasn't been modeled real well. People have followed, as you said, very charismatic preachers in the pulpit at local churches or on online or on television. Let me just give you one. Can you imagine? Can you, in your wildest imagination, Barry? There's something that's going on in your life, in your family, that's like serious. It's like life defining, and you calling Joel Osteen for pastoral advice.
Yeah.
You might ask him for advice on hair gel, but you would not ask this man. And I know this sounds judgmental, but people listen to him all the time. He has no idea who they are. And so when you take that kind of a relationship into a local congregation and then wonder why it's not working, this that we're talking about, the relationship between shepherds, congregant, sheep, this is something that we have to work out. We have to be active. We have to be intentional, to use a kind of a word that's being used this year, I think, a lot. We have to be intentional regarding this relationship. And the only way to be intentional is to start to on both sides of this, we're going to have to let our guard down just a little bit.
Yeah.
Not looking at each other through the abuse, because sheep have been abused by so-called shepherds. Shepherds that have been abused by so-called sheep. My pastor years ago said, my pastor years ago, Jim said, "Son, you gotta remember this one thing: sheep will bite you."
Yeah.
And after you get bit so long, you quit wanting to pet them. This is something. But here's what the word says: that He will do this. He will raise up shepherds according to His own heart. So we can either roll with this thing, with this that He's doing. We can either be a part of it and accept the calling that each of us have, or we can fight it. Continue to fight this. Well, newsflash: Jeremiah chapter 23, verses 1 through 4 come before verse 7 and 8, which is the greater exodus. So is that saying to us that greater exodus isn't going to happen until we get the shepherd-sheep thing right?
Well, I think a part of where we need to go to today, and you're alluding to it here, and what you were just now saying, there are a large number of people that I have encountered over the years. They came out of situations where they blamed their former pastor for all that was wrong.
Mm.
All the wrong doctrine, all the wrong perspectives, all the wrong celebrations, wrong terminologies. And it is a bit unsettling when you realize that standard church doctrine, in some regards, doesn't necessarily line up with Scripture. And so as you deal with that weeding out of things process, it's hard not to have some animosity or hurt feelings or ideas of, I was lied to, that kind of thing. But I can also tell you that probably the vast majority of pastors who are in pulpits and preaching what they've been trained and what they have been taught themselves, are doing so with sincerity and with an understanding of this is just right. This is what I know to be true. And if we're honest, If we've been in Hebraic roots, as you and I have for a couple decades now, and you're teaching, there are still some times that you have to go back and say, I had that wrong.
Oh,
I need to back up here, and we need to readdress something other because I've got a better understanding. So we need to give people a benefit of the doubt and give them a little grace here. We also have to understand that there are those then that have come out of such situations with a chip on their shoulder and some angst about them, and they show up at the local Hebrew Roots congregation or study group in a living room or something other, and they got this edge, this combative,
yeah.
aggressive, defensive edge. We have to allow for that to subside a bit before they can become teachable. Many years ago, a lady gave me a very wise piece of advice. She said, the key to walking in Messiah correctly is to keep a teachable spirit. Once you cannot be taught, if you ever get to the place where you know it all and you can no longer learn anything, that's a dangerous place to be. You have to keep a teachable spirit.
Yeah.
So just to finish here, Mike, we've all encountered, I think, those individuals that they have spent enough or so much time online looking at the conspiracy theories and the hard-edged teachers and those that have drawn very definite lines in the sand. Either you believe it this way or you're deceived as you were when you were still sitting on a pew somewhere. And when you don't follow suit with their thinking, when you say, I disagree with that, then they want to divide your flock, or they want to publicly slander you for being deceived.
Mm-hmm.
I got an email from a guy a few weeks ago that was irate that I mispronounced something in Hebrew. I didn't grow up speaking Hebrew. He probably didn't either. But I pronounced it something in a way that he disagreed with, and you would have thought that the world had come to an end.
Oh, yeah.
I had a scripture translation here on my bookshelf. Someone gave me 20 years ago. I may have cracked it once or twice in that period of time, but it was a gift. I stuck it on my shelf. It's there. Sometimes, Frank Houts of blessed memory taught me a number of years ago, you have to look at that which you disagree with and be willing to try to understand why you disagree with it. You can't just accept, I disagree with it. Well, have you studied it out and know why? No, but no one else likes it, or it's, the rumor is, or the storyline. If you don't know for yourself, so if I read a translation and I disagree with the translation, it doesn't mean you throw the whole book out. Sometimes, I've got Jewish commentaries here. I don't agree with everything that Rashi says, but Rashi has taught me a lot. There have been some insights that I've gained. It's like, wow, I had never thought of it that way.
Let me back up to something. You were talking about the concept of a shepherd that's, you're teaching what you knew to teach. I think one of the aspects of this shepherd-sheep relationship is both being willing to say, I was wrong, and not blaming the other one for it. Okay, let me give you two examples. Number one, I pastored an incredible group of people in North Florida. This was some of the greatest years of mine and Kathy's lives. Struggles, challenges, yes, but the relationships still to this day are amazing. And so, but there was a time after I left that congregation that I actually called and went back, and I had the group that was still kind of intact. And I sat them down and I said, I have to ask your forgiveness. Please forgive me because I taught you wrong. But I want you to never lose the heart in which we sought the Father with. Because it was that heart that brought us from the things that were wrong in that day into the walk that we were in. And so as a shepherd, you have to be willing to stand up in front of the sheep and say, that was a bad call. I needed to do some things different. Let's continue to walk together. The other side is that sheep need to understand that at times they're in the wrong too. Something that I'm much more, I choose more than I used to is weddings. I don't do a lot of weddings anymore. There was a time in ministry that I pretty much, somebody that I knew asked me if I do a wedding for them. Okay, yeah, whatever. I don't do that much anymore because of the consequences that I've seen. But I had a couple that was part of our church there in Florida that had started attending, and all of a sudden they decided to get married, and it was going to be like, next week or so. And so I sat down with them and counseled them. And I said, I think you guys need to put some time here. I really don't feel like you need to rush into this. There's some things that are going on. And I just really feel like you need some time. Okay. They were like, no. Everything that you're talking about, we've already dealt with, yada, 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 yada. In the end, I finally said, okay, I'll do the wedding. They broke up. It wasn't, but just a very short amount of time. I mean, we're talking about within months they broke up. And you know who they blamed? Me. Really? You don't blame the shepherd for your bad actions. And pastors, shepherds should not blame the sheep when they make a bad call either. We in this relationship that is being worked in, I think this is what we heard a lot at Revive about community. The greatest aspect of a community is humility. Being able to say, I remember that day and I was an idiot. Being able to say you're wrong. Being able to humbly ask someone's forgiveness for something that they did. That is one of the greatest aspects that a community can have. As someone used to say to me years ago, humility always wins. There's not a time that humility doesn't win out in the end.
Yeah. Mike, we are in such a day that people are looking for the general of the Ruach to stand up and say, I have discerned the will of the Father, and this is how we are to approach this current day and all of its stuff. Follow me. And if someone were to do that, then dependent upon their perceived ability, there would be a group that would say, yeah, let's pick up that banner and let's holler charge. But the reality is we're not so much in need of such a leader as we are, as you mentioned, the development of a community. We need to know that our fellow believers are going to walk alongside us, and whatever I lack, they will supply. And where they're hurting, I can minister and I can help them. We are needing more than charismatic speakers, teachers. We're needing shepherds who will patiently lead flocks. When we started House of David over 20 years ago, my approach was, Shimon Kefa, or Peter, is stepping out of the boat, walking on the water. This has not been done before, but y'all follow me. Here we go. And a somewhat large group, got out of the boat and walked on water with me. Now I'm trying to get them to shore. with stability under our feet. And it's almost as if I'm standing almost neck deep in the water. I'm going to be the last one on shore. I got to make sure everybody makes it. The shift has come from man out front, y'all follow, to let me help you. When I first came out, I said, don't call me pastor anymore, because in my estimation, it carried a negative tone. My people are beginning to call me pastor again.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a little, initially it was like, I don't know, I'm not sure about this. And now I'm understanding that my role has changed. And it's not just the local group at House of David. Now I'm developing also a community online through 10-minute tours, so this Foundations for Life, etc. And there are people out there that need help, that need some sense of community. And they don't have it locally, so they find it digitally, online.
Yep.
And if I can help in that respect, I may not be able to get to where you are. But if you're, as someone writes me and says, please pray, this is what's going on, Laura and I take that to heart and we begin to pray. Sometimes that's the only way that I know how to do it, but then I try to follow up. What's going on now? How are things now? What are the most recent developments? You have to try to stay in touch. But we need that, Mike. We can.
Oh, yeah.
The Hebrew Roots community cannot continue to develop based on. I'm not throwing stones at anyone, but charismatic teaching. There is still a role for the teacher. There is still a need for that thing to continue to develop. We need those insights and that training. But the most important role that I'm discerning in the body of Messiah right now is the pastor, the shepherd. Not as glamorous, not as flamboyant, and maybe not as charismatic, but trusted. And they're the one on the other end of the phone call when you're hurting and when you're in need. It's the one who sits down with someone just getting started and with patience says, okay, let's go back to square one and let's look at this thing and systematically begin to walk them through. It's eldership, it's shepherding, it's caregiving. It's the one who is compassionate, but it's also the one that knows how to correct and admonish, even to reprove and rebuke at times if that's what's necessary in order for sheep to be willing to stay in the flock. The sheep that feel like, well, I can find pasture on my own. I can find my own water. I can do this all by myself. That's a dangerous place to be, because you're very susceptible to a wolf.
Yep.
And that, there's a lot of characters in the flock. There's sheep, there's a shepherd, but there are goats, those that are contrary. There are wolves, there are bears, there are lions. And you got to be aware of who is who. Not everybody who's in the flock is a sheep or a shepherd.
And this is why we need, Shaul talked about this fivefold ministry, and this has not been talked about much in the Hebrew Roots walk. The fivefold ministry goes back to the Tanakh, back to the Torah, that we could actually put it into, the different people. But it goes to the evangelist, to the apostle, prophet, evangelist, pastor, and teacher. And I'll never forget, and this is a little corny, like I've never done anything corny, but I'll never forget a pastor or a teacher that said the fivefold ministry is like your hand. It's like the apostle, the prophet, the evangelist, the pastor, and the teacher. And the apostle is the one that can you can touch any of your fingers with the thumb. And the apostle can be a person that if needs to prophesy, can do the work of an evangelist, a pastor, a teacher. That's it. Then you have the prophet that points out the things. You have the evangelist, that longest finger that goes out into the nations. Then you got the pastor, which is the ring finger. It's really your weakest finger on your hand is the pastor. So there's a gentleness, and then there's also the teacher. The teacher is the smallest, but yet when you make the small finger the largest finger, something's not going to work right on the hand. If you take off one of the fingers, if you say, well, that ministry and that one, those are done away with. Well, how, which finger would you like to get rid of on your hand?
Yeah.
Ask anybody that's been, worked meat department in a grocery store, which finger would you like to get rid of first? And how does the hand work? It doesn't work real well if you have one of those fingers. Well, here's another one. Something that just dawned on me, Barry. I've never thought about this. The pastor, that ring, it's the ring finger. The finger that is the one with the ring of covenant on it.
Right.
The pastor is the one that should be closely connected to the covenant, keeping us in the pasture of the covenant.
Right. Well, there's no way we could cover this subject and just this amount of time and do a thorough job. So we may address this further in the future. In particular, on this subject, we would love to hear your heart. Maybe you could write and tell us what it is that you would like to see in the shepherd, and how it is that shepherds could do a better job. If you are a shepherd, maybe you have something along the lines of leadership wisdom you'd like to share as well. We love to hear your comments, your questions, and thank you so much for watching Foundations for Life. Mike and I really appreciate it. Share this on your social media, share it with your friends, and we hope to see you again next week.
You got it.
So then, shalom.